It is 2:05, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to be giving a presentation on college planning and college consulting. So I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation now. Okay, so we will be sending out a recording afterwards of the presentation and the slides as well. Please do ask your questions in the chat, which I will check at the end of the presentation. We ask that you keep your questions for the end because we may answer your question during the course of the presentation. And yeah, that's about it. So everyone is muted so that we can minimize background noise. And today we'll be talking about three main things. So first of all, my name is Amber Cameron, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my background in a second. But I would also ask that everyone, if you could please mute yourself so that we minimize the background noise. That would be super helpful. So we'll be talking about three main things. The first one is, what are admissions officers looking for? Part two is going to be, what do the parents of 8th to 10th graders need to know? And part three is going to be about, what do the parents of 8th, 11th, and 12th graders need to know? So in terms of who's going to be speaking today, we're both college consultants at Potomac Oak Tutoring. My name is Amber Cameron, and accompanying me is going to be Miss Angelica Tumbas. And in terms of my background, I attended Swarthmore College, where I majored in math and psychology. Afterwards, I went to the London School of Economics, where I studied organizational psychology. And then thereafter, I was an executive recruiter working with strategy consultants, helping them to transition from roles in strategy consulting into roles in industry. And then over 5 years ago, I joined Potomac Oak Tutoring as a college consultant. And so that's my background. It's work that I very much enjoy. So I'm now going to turn it over to Miss Angelica to tell you a little bit more about herself.
Thanks, Amber. It's so nice to be speaking with everybody. As Amber said, my name's Angelica. I graduated from Columbia University with a Bachelor's of Arts and a double major in political science and nonfiction writing. I also spent a year studying history and EU politics at the University of Oxford, and then worked. I started my own editorial consulting company, working with authors and helping them develop their stories and manuscripts and pitch them to publishers. And that kind of led me to the admission space, which I've been working in for the past 5 years. And I really love working with students and just helping them, develop their voice and their stories and helping them present those in the college admissions process.
Okay, thank you, Angelica. So between the two of us, we have over 10 years of combined experience working with students on college planning and admissions. We do have unique insider's knowledge, and we are really proud to have a proven track record of success in the work that we do. So 56% of our students applying to top tier schools, like the Ivies and top 20, have gained admissions into these programs, which is something that we're really proud of. Okay, so as I said, what are admissions officers looking for? So I'm going to start talking about this topic. And so I think most of you probably know, the two big gatekeepers for college admissions. Obviously having a high GPA and weighted GPA and test scores, right? Your grades on the one hand and your test scores on the other are going to help students to avoid the automatic no. What the grade requirements are and the testing requirements are really vary by school. But that's kind of the first, okay, does this person pass this first check, right? So common questions regarding grades and curriculum. Which matters more? Is it GPA or weighted GPA? So GPA is your raw grades, and weighted GPA includes an extra brownie point for the honors and the AP classes that you take. Which one's more important? What about honors versus APs? How many AP classes should a student be taking? Do AP scores matter? And what are the current trends affecting admissions? So these are some of the things that we talk with students about and that we encourage you to consider in the college planning process. Other common questions are, regarding the admissions tests. Which one should I take, the ACT or the SAT? And when should I take it? So this is another thing to be keeping in mind during the planning process and that we work together with students on. Other criteria other than the grades and the test scores are subjective factors are often make or break, especially for Asian students. So the first of these are Tier 1 activities, which are activities for which a student is garnering attention or recognition for on a national or even international level. That's really going to help them to stand out from the other highly qualified students who are going to be applying to these schools. Okay, so these Tier 1 activities where a student's, getting some kind of recognition for something is really, really important for this caliber of school. So other activity metrics that we'll work on with students, well, thinking about things like engagement, so are you doing 20 activities once a semester, right? Or are you really deeply involved in a few relevant core activities? Your leadership, so are you going to be shooting for leadership at some point in your high school career in some of these activities? Passion, so hopefully you're passionate about it rather than just doing it to kind of have it on your resume, because it does come across. Focus, so we like to say we'd like to see more of a focused student than kind of that jack of all trades, master of none. And then that quality, as I was alluding to earlier, is more important than quantity when it comes to your extracurriculars. Okay, so something that Miss Angelica is going to be talking about later are memorable essays with personality that are not cliches. So there are, easily found cliche topics on the internet, things like your typical sports essay or, or like, a mission trip or something like that. It's not saying you can't write about those topics, but it better be a pretty amazing, unusual angle on it if you're going to. So we help students to consider the topics in light of, what the cliches are and in light of what their narrative or profile is that are going to be most additive to their application. Next up, letters of recommendation. And so these are your letters of recommendation from your teachers and also from other people in your life who can speak to and hopefully be known at the schools that you are the most interested in and be a known entity to them. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about 8th to 10th grade planning. So 8th grade is when we do start our college planning services for students. There is no, too late or anything like that. Some people sign up in 8th grade, some people sign up in 9th grade. It is a little too late, in 11th grade because you're going to be applying to college then. But so here are some of the topics that we'll be exploring with students and parents, of course. So which high school is your student attending and why? We know there are these various magnet programs, etc. And so, why is your student going where they're going? And next up is, what are their potential academic majors? So what are they possibly interested in studying further in college and why? Are they being strategic in picking these goals? Are you tracking your students' trajectory via Naviance? So Naviance is a really nifty tool that, pretty much everyone in this area has access to. Sometimes it's called Family Connection, but you can look up each school, and if there's data for that particular college or university, you can see very localized data from your high school to the particular educational institution. So that means you can see the average GPA and weighted GPA and test scores for admitted students from your school to, say, the University of Maryland or Duke University, which is really useful. And you can also see how many students apply are admitted and attend these schools each year. So the quality kind of varies school by school, but where it's, where it's available, it's really, really helpful because, that data can vary from school to school. Okay, so does their goal match their status? So, one thing we want to avoid is students getting to the admissions process and being really passionate about a particular school, but unfortunately, their status in terms of their grades and test scores really, it means it's going to be very much an uphill battle for them, right? So making sure that they're educated and that you're tracking the trajectory via Naviance and making sure that they're on track to be a qualified applicant for the schools that they're interested in. Okay, so does their curriculum match? So are they making sure that, given their interests, they're taking the right classes and fulfilling all of the requirements of the schools that they're interested in? If not, what can be done to alleviate their academic profile? So say we're talking about maybe like a 10th grader. So what are some things that we can do to make them more attractive and more qualified for the schools and majors that they're interested in? Okay, do they have a test prep timeline? Ideally, you want to avoid the situation where they're, just starting to do testing in the summer before, their senior year, and so they have a little bit of time to prep. But what that looks like, as with so many of these questions, very much depends upon the student, and we really can't make a recommendation without knowing your student, their profile, their goals, their strengths, so on and so forth. So that test prep timeline could look very different for one student versus another student. So do these interests reflect what they are doing outside of school, their extracurriculars outside of school? Is your student taking advantage of summer breaks? Are you aware of what the different options are in our area, or maybe not, maybe even outside of our area? And are you, kind of taking advantage of those, applying to pre-college programs, applying to different kinds of camps that could be relevant to your students' interests, et cetera? Are they prioritizing properly? So if they are spending, 99% of their time on sports, but they're not interested in doing something related to sports as a career, and they are not going to be recruited on the basis of sports, then maybe that's, a little overweighted on the sports side, right? That's an extreme example, but it gives you an idea of kind of how we might evaluate, a student's extracurricular mix. And then what are their entrees versus desserts? So for this question, it really has to do with their focused and career oriented activities, right? So, if they're really passionate about STEM, what are the STEM activities that they're doing? But we also don't want students to appear so, one-dimensional that, all they're doing is CS activities and they end up coming across as like a robot or something like that. So what are the other activities that we are calling desserts in this analogy that are allowing a student to appear as focused, but also as a well-rounded person? Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the current trends affecting admissions. As you're all aware, there are impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the admissions process. And here is what we told our seniors at the beginning of the crisis. And so some points here that turned out to be very, very salient. Testing optional isn't a cause for celebration. There were some winners and losers, as we talked about in that scenario. So, people for whom their grades were relatively better than their test scores, they were going to come out as the winners, and people who their testing was relatively better compared to their grades, they were obviously not going to be the winners in this scenario. But in general, things being testing optional, it meant that everything else became even more important. So your academics and grades and your courses became even more important. The extracurriculars became more important. The essays became more important. The letters of recommendation became more important. And the interviews became more important, because lacking that one big like chunk of the evaluative criteria, you know, admissions had to rely on these other elements even more. Let's see, campus visits were completely different. Obviously, there's a lot of other ways that colleges came up with to engage with students. And then there was a saturation of certain majors and programs, obviously kind of things like life sciences and public health and things like that. And so, you know, if you had a good background for that, then that could be beneficial. But, you know, a lot of people, you know, were like, oh, I want to do life sciences now. And if you didn't have a good background, that, you know, that you were going to be facing some really stiff competition. So with these factors in mind, you know, we really reiterated with our students, like, demonstrated interest is key. And so demonstrated interest is showing your interest to the school through engaging with them in a variety of different ways. And we emphasize to students, don't think that just because you can't do visits that you can't engage. There are, you know, info sessions and engaging with them in terms of social media and, you know, writing emails and whatever the case might be. So with, you know, the huge public institutions, demonstrated interest is not such a big thing, but certainly with private institutions, it is important. And the reason that it is because they're, you know, usually they're always looking to improve their yield, right? And so yield is the percentage of students who they offer admission to who attend. So it's a measure of their kind of popularity or selectivity. And so, you know, they always want to increase their yield. And so by knowing that a student is super interested in them, by them showing all these different ways that they're interested in them, it shows, it makes them feel more confident that the student's more likely to attend if offered a place, rather than, you know, just throwing kind of like another admissions application in there just to have another school on the list, right? So demonstrated interest was very key, and we worked with our students on that. We encouraged you know, students and parents to highly consider applying early decision. Angelica is going to talk a little bit more about that later. And to consider applying to more colleges than you normally would. And we did see that on the Common App. I think it was a 9% increase in the number of colleges that students were applying to, and that you make sure that safeties are real safeties that won't yield protect you. So remember I talked about yield. Yield is that percentage that you offer admissions to who attend. So yield protection is if they think that you're not really going to attend, you're not really serious about them, and say you're like overqualified based upon the gatekeepers that we talked about earlier, the grades and the test scores, then they can yield protect you, which means, like, you know, they defer you or they deny you because they don't think that you're serious, and they don't want to offer you admission and for you to turn them down and for that to hurt the appearance of their selectivity. So here it says, for example, out-of-state schools. So if you're way higher and, you know, they don't think that you're going to attend, then they could defer or not accept you. So here are some of the takeaways. Another slide of takeaways here. So our learnings were overall, it really has been harder for everyone, even those winners who, you know, were relatively lucky in this scenario because they had the good grades and the comparatively not so good test scores, right? It's still been harder for them because the Naviance is less reliable. What that means is, you know, we expected to see, and not all the data is in, so we don't have all of it yet, but we expected to see average weighted GPAs go up across the board as schools relied upon the data that they did have, which was the weighted GPAs, right? Or GPAs, depending on the college. Some colleges don't use weighted GPA. But yeah, so pools are likely to be bigger, and that is something that is explained in these two articles, which you're, you know, more than welcome to take a look after we send the slides out. And expected higher rates of deferrals due to wild yields. So, you know, what wild means kind of varies in this context. It depends on, you know, where you are, I think, in the pecking order, right? So some of the mid-tier schools saw their yields drop. Some of the state schools had like an expected much higher yield. Like University of Maryland was, you know, offering places in Spring Connection, which is like their, you know, I mean, you're still admitted to the school, but you start in the spring instead, to people who had very, very high stats, you know? So, so they were expecting higher yields than normal. And then for the most competitive schools, as you can see here, they had their early applications rise significantly. So as you can see here, they rose 22% at Brown, all the way up to almost 50%, touching 50% at Columbia. So that means you have much bigger pools of people who are applying early. It does help to apply early, you know, to apply early decision, which is a binding decision where you say, if you accept me, I will attend your school. And it's like a binding legal contract, right? So it does help, and Angelica will talk about this more in a little bit, but we have a lot more people applying early decision, right? So that made it a lot harder. If you have 50% more students applying to Columbia, and part of that, you know, of course, is students who wouldn't have been eligible based upon their test scores, who now suddenly were eligible to apply early, right? And when I say eligible, like, I mean qualified, right? So, you know, somebody who had like a 4.8 and like a, I don't know, 25 on the ACT, they wouldn't have had a shot, right, before, but all of a sudden they just have a 4.8. So you see these you know, applications rates rising, so that makes it you know, tougher for everyone. Next up is another link here from Forbes, and we expect to see that trend continue this year. So more students will continue to apply early because we're expecting as of now for it to be test optional. But what test optional means is a little bit nuanced, right? And it says here, one of the trends that this the author of this article had identified was standardized tests will be optional but preferred. And so they said here at Penn that 75% of students admitted in the early round submitted standardized test scores, whereas only 25% did not. So that's a pretty telling stat there. Doesn't mean that if you don't have the you know, the test scores that you're not going to be admitted, but they clearly prefer to have it. So let's see, I have a couple of chats here that I want to do we expect these crazy application stats to continue in the next several years? And then so do we expect the stats? Certainly for the next year, and then we'll just have to wait and see. It really, I think, depends too on like what's going to happen, you know, with standardized testing. Like right now, you know, we're expecting, because over 900 schools have signed up to be test optional, that that's going to continue, right? So certainly for the next cycle, but then after that, you know, just depending upon how things go, we'll have to wait and see. And some schools, you know, have signed up to be test optional, test blind on an ongoing basis for 2 or 3 years. Swarthmore, Tufts, you know, different like very high caliber schools have already signed up to be, you know, test blind or test optional. And then the other person had asked, oh, what's the criteria to apply early decision? Great question. So there is no criteria. You can apply early decision, you know, wherever you want, as long as you're willing to apply. You're applying to college at the appropriate time, and you're willing and able to undertake this binding decision. You can't apply early decision to more than one place, right? Because you're promising, if you accept me, I will go there. So there's, you know, somebody who has very, very low stats could apply, you know, early decision to, you know, a top 5 school, right? They're not going to have a very good shot unless they're in one of these special categories that Angelica is going to talk about a little later, but you could. Okay. So let's see. Okay, great. So now I'm going to turn it over to Angelica.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amber. So as you know, we talk about transitioning from college planning into the consulting stages, you know, for 11th and 12th graders, we know that this process brings along with it a lot of stress, you know, for students and families alike. And we really do hope that our kind of individualized, methodical, and data-driven approach kind of helps to alleviate the stress in this process. So some of the kind of primary questions that we ask our students and that kind of drive, our consulting process are, is a student's list of colleges, are they balanced? So what does this mean? This means, we want to make sure, sometimes students come to us at the beginning of the process. They might have, 12 schools on their list, and all of those schools are, top 20 schools. So what we would encourage them to do, and what we help with, is to kind of broaden the search so that, so that their schools are not only extreme reaches or reaches, but they also have, a healthy dose of targets and safeties as well. Kind of what comes along with this territory is, we ask our students, are they being realistic? So especially when it comes to safeties, we want to make sure that these safeties are real safeties. And we, as we know from kind of this COVID and post-COVID admissions landscape, everything is a little bit more competitive. So really ensuring that the safeties on a student's list are true safeties. Another kind of big part of our conversation is determining whether colleges are a good fit for our students. So that means not only, are the extreme reaches or reaches on a student's list a good fit, but that a student would be, just as excited to attend their safeties or targets, and that the particular programs at those schools fit their prospective interests, both academically and extracurricularly. Another kind of really important part of our conversation is the process of applying early. We ask our students where they are applying early. We help with kind of the reasoning behind that as well. If a student has more compelling reasons to apply either early action or early decision to a place, they're probably going to have a more compelling and persuasive application as well. Will you visit? That's also a big part of our conversation, asking students and helping them kind of plan out when they will actually see different campuses. Obviously this year, that's been more of a challenge and everything's kind of been in a virtual capacity, but we're optimistic that, moving forward, hopefully things will normalize a bit and that students and families will once again be able to return for in-person visits to campuses and admissions offices. Are you leveraging all your contacts? So what does this mean? We do inquire as to, whether students might have, people that they could reach out to on campuses. This could include, student leaders, other students, potentially any admissions contacts. That's something that we definitely investigate and incorporate into our process. Will you interview? This is also, a very key part of, of the process. Some schools, offer interviews. We are pretty upfront with our students as to which schools those are and what a student could expect from an interview process. Who are your advocates? This kind of goes along with discussing teacher recommendations and, trying to determine who would be the best people to speak to, like not only a student's academic profile or some of their extracurricular achievements perhaps, but also, to their character and, helping kind of make their application more multidimensional and human. Within the process, we like to discuss obviously brainstorming narratives, especially for that, common app personal statement, which I'll discuss in more detail in a little bit. And then we also ask our students, whether or not they're preparing supplementals. So along with that, personal statement, most colleges, some do not, but a lot of schools have supplemental essays. So that's a big part of our consulting process. And then a very, very important part of the consulting process is timeline. I think that the timeline and sticking to an organized timeline, I think is one of the biggest characteristics in helping a student put their best foot forward in the process. I don't care if you are, the best, the best writer on the planet. If you're writing an application essay, the night before, a couple weeks before, good writing takes time. So with the college consulting and prep timeline, we typically like to start with students, halfway through, their junior year. really work on obviously their testing strategy, their CV, solidifying their college list, and then we work on brainstorming their Common App and supplements and drafting those. And in an ideal world, everything is drafted, before students step foot in their first class of senior fall. And we like to do this, regardless of whether a student is applying for early decision or not. It's because students' GPA is also such a crucial part of their application. We find that our most successful students are students who have spent the summer really drafting and refining their essays, have spent months really thinking over and strategizing, and putting forth the most comprehensive and eloquent narrative possible. So we like to have all of the applications pretty finalized before a student starts their 12th grade year. Can I have the next slide, please? So when it comes to researching programs at different schools, I'm sure that some of you guys have heard of Naviance. If you haven't, it's essentially kind of a database. At some point, your high school counselor will likely be providing you with a login. And basically, when you enter the Naviance system, you can see where students from your school have applied and what the admissions results of their application have been. So for instance, you might see one school, let's say you could search Boston University and see, in the last 5 years, how many students have applied, how many students have been accepted, rejected, deferred, and what were the stats of those students in different categories. And this can definitely be a useful tool in terms of trying to conceptualize whether a school is a safety, a target, a reach, an extreme reach, and kind of fitting it into those levels of varying difficulty. But it does not tell the whole story. And I think that this is something that's really, really important to understand. One component of that is COVID and how that's kind of shifted the admissions landscape. We anticipate that, for this cycle and for some of the coming cycles with test optional, the Naviance data might be a little less reliable than it has been in previous years. But then another really big factor in determining, where a school falls on a student's list in terms of its categorization of difficulty relates to kind of the department or major or even the school that a student is applying to within a larger university. So this is an example that I like to give because I think it is really illuminating as to how much kind of variance there can be even within one, with applications to one university. This here, kind of this 4.56 and 34, that's a 4.56 GPA and a 34 ACT score. That data is from Wooten High School. And it's for applications to Carnegie Mellon University. So a fantastic university in Pittsburgh. So, if you looked at the Naviance data, what you would see there is that on average, a student with that GPA and with that testing was the average for an accepted student, and that the admit rate from Wooten was around 20%. However, if we look at applications to different schools within Carnegie Mellon, I think, two to kind of point your attention to would be that DC College, that's the Dietrich College of Humanities at Carnegie Mellon, and then SDS, which for instance is the College of Computer Science. We see a pretty drastic difference in the acceptance rate. So, for that College of Humanities, the 22% acceptance rate, much closer to that Wooten average. And then for the School of Computer Science, the average rests at around 7%, so far lower. So when, within Naviance, it does not tell us which students applied to which school. So we really do work on looking at data beyond Naviance and crafting a full picture of, the competition in the particular departments and schools that a student is applying to, in order to understand how likely their candidacy would be at that in that particular program that they would be applying to. So in terms of the application timeline, I know that we've spoken a little bit, and I just talked about kind of our timeline for having our students having their materials prepped and how we like to approach that. But I guess in terms of external deadlines, regular decision applications are typically due between beginning of January and February of the student's senior year. And then there are kind of 3 categories of applications that would be due at an earlier time. So early decision, as we discussed, is a binding agreement. That application is due kind of usually somewhere between October 15th and November 15th. Sometimes maybe later in November, but most of the time within that window. And students typically hear back from that, from admissions at their early decision school around the middle of December. And the news that a student could get from a university that they've applied to early decision would be, a rejection, an acceptance, or a deferral. And we also, help with deferral advising and waitlist advising and all of that. But with early decision, some of the positives of applying somewhere ED, and it is something that we really do encourage our students to do if they do have a first choice school, and if financial aid is not a concern. I'll get to that in a moment. But the great thing about it is that you can hear early. So, best case scenario, if you get into your early school, you are done in the middle of December and can kind of, enjoy a little bit of your senior spring. Also, when it comes to the early decision admittance rate, there are higher rates of admission. If you do have time, after this presentation, I've linked an article here. It's actually more of a spreadsheet that compiles and juxtaposes kind of top universities and their recent early admittance rates as opposed to their regular decision rates. So that can just be helpful, just to kind of start wrapping your mind around some of the differences in acceptance rate at specific schools. So I would highly recommend taking a look at that. But, I think definitely applying early decision, there is an advantage, but quantifying that advantage can sometimes be a little bit more complicated than it might seem. I think an example of, a highly competitive school that offers early decision would be Dartmouth, for instance. So their regular decision admit rate is around, between kind of 8 and 9%. And then, this year we saw that their ED acceptance rate kind of was just a little bit over 26%. So what does this tell us? Kind of at first glance, early decision, maybe, you seem to have maybe a 3 times better chance of being accepted ED if you look at it that way, but there are other kind of confounding variables in that data set that are important to recognize. So a couple of those would be, one, the early applicant pool is oftentimes a more competitive pool than the regular pool. You might have some students who are kind of throwing a Hail Mary and applying to somewhere that is a way far reach. But you also have students who have, taken time and finished the application early. And, those students tend to maybe be a little bit more organized. They also may be students who feel really confident about their junior spring grades and aren't necessarily waiting, aren't as worried about having their senior fall grades be taken into consideration and having the time to perhaps bring those up. Some other kind of factors in the early decision pool would be, that's typically when athletic recruits are signed. So that's, a different pool that that's kind of feeding into that higher rate of acceptance. And then additionally, a lot of legacy students apply early. So an example that I think is illuminating and helpful would be at the University of Pennsylvania, for instance. They pretty publicly say that a legacy student applying ED on average has around a 50% chance of acceptance, which is pretty staggering. So, for the regular student who is, who might be qualified but is not a sports recruit or does not have legacy status, ED is still definitely competitive. And it can be important to kind of understand those factors when quantifying what the advantage would be applying early decision, because it is a binding decision. It is a big decision for students and for families. We do caution students against applying ED if financial aid is a concern. This is because students and families do not get to receive their financial aid award before receiving their decisions. So if it's binding, we encourage students to apply ED if it's their dream school, if it's your first choice, and if financial aid is not a concern. So in addition to early decision, not all schools offer early decision. There's early action. I would say more schools offer early action programs. Unlike early decision, early action is not binding. The timeline for the early action applications are similar to the early decision ones, typically, October through December. And then you do typically hear, in December and maybe a little bit later for some schools, but it's an earlier notification. There are similar benefits, in terms of higher rates of admission. As you would expect, the benefit maybe isn't quite as high in most cases as an early decision application, because schools aren't protecting their yield in the same way with the students that they admit for early decision versus early action. But there are, students applying early action are also made eligible for different scholarship considerations. And we encourage, our students, if a school on their list has an early action option, we strongly encourage them to use it and apply as early as possible, just because it's also a way of showing, demonstrated interest in some cases, because you've taken the time to finish the application early. In some ways, you're communicating to the admissions office that you've put thought into it. It might be one of your top choices. It's not just an application that was submitted, the night before or kind of on a whim. And then the third type of earlier application would be a rolling application. So rolling admissions, typically kind of accompany state schools. An example of this would be Penn State, for instance. They have a rolling admissions program, and these operate on a first come, first served basis. So what does this mean? It means that students who have a school that has rolling admission on their college list should apply as early as possible, because spots dwindle as the time passes. Next slide, please. Some kind of additional factors that are really important in enhancing a student's candidacy to any school that they apply to. A huge component of that is letters of recommendation. So, these are really, really important, because they help, in addition to your essays, to humanize a student and to provide kind of outside perspective. In terms of letters of recommendation, teachers, counselors, employers, coaches, alumni are all eligible to potentially write letters of recommendation. Different schools have different policies for their letters of recommendation. So most schools will require, at least one or two academic letters of recommendation. But again, part of this is looking at a student's individualized college list and going by those requirements. It is really, really important that students ask their recommenders early. I think that as an educator, we've all been in the position where someone's come very last minute. I think if someone gives you the space and time to write a recommendation, you're probably gonna do a better job, and maybe be a little bit more gratuitous with your recommendation as well. And then we also help students kind of provide their recommenders with details that will help them, write the best recommendation possible. Typically, students will ask their junior year teachers in their core subjects that are relevant to their prospective academic major to write the recommendations. And then just another thing that's really important that we keep an eye out is being careful when matching letters of recommendations to specific schools on a student's college list. What does this mean? As I mentioned, different schools have different requirements for their letters of recommendations. So you don't want to send 3 letters of recommendation to a school that only asks for 2, or maybe miss a letter of recommendation for a school that requires more. So being really intentional about sending letters of recommendations and meeting the requirements of specific schools is key. And then finally, some factors that do impact a student's candidacy and their likelihood of admission would be athletic status. As I mentioned, there are often, maybe some different rules for athletic recruits, musical abilities, any type of, art supplement or exceptional, musical ability is fantastic. Same with other exceptional talents. Interviews are also very, very important. If you are offered an interview, we always say that you should 100%, take the opportunity to participate in that interview. A great example that I like to give is with MIT. They've kind of published their data that out of the students that they offer an interview to, and the students who accept an interview, the admissions acceptance rate is 10.8%. However, out of the students who are offered an interview and reject that interview, if you're one of those students, your chances of admission drop to below 1%. So what does this tell us? It is very important to accept an interview. It's a way of showing demonstrated interest. So that's definitely something that we emphasize. Legacy can also impact a student's candidacy. Of course, there are different degrees of legacy. Obviously the strongest would be if you have a sibling or if you have a parent who has attended that undergraduate school, but kind of, different variations of legacy are something that we would discuss. And then residency as well is a factor, especially when applying to state schools. If you are a Maryland resident, for instance, and you're applying to UMD, you're going to have, you're going to have an advantage over out-of-state students. Same with if you're, a Virginia resident and you're applying to UVA. Obviously, that can work the other way around. Just being cognizant of where you might have an advantage in your candidacy and where you might have a disadvantage is an important part of kind of evaluating where you might want to apply. Next slide, please. And finally, I know that the essays can kind of seem like this, just kind of, well, they can, I think for pretty much all students, they're a daunting part of the application process, because I think that most high school students, although you probably have a great deal of experience, writing in your English class or history class, all of that has been primarily academic writing instead of creative writing. So it can be a challenge to transition to writing in the first person and to perhaps, maybe exploring a more creative approach. But that is something that we help with in the consulting process, and really work with our students to help them craft something that is authentic. I think what we found, and I think what we could all speak to on our team would be that essays are most kind of effective when they are authentic. So what does that mean? It means being personable, passionate, purposeful, original, descriptive, memorable, and also being strategic as well. I think especially with the Common App personal statement, we talk a lot about what that is supposed to capture versus maybe supplement essays. That's a big part of strategy. I often like to say to my students that the Common App essay is more about capturing kind of how you think and how you approach problem solving than it might be about highlighting some of your achievements in the same way that supplemental essays do. But of course that varies from student to student, and that would be an individualized discussion. In terms of just kind of understanding the scope of what essays go into this process, most schools require 1 to 4 supplemental essays. That being said, even students who are applying to, let's say, 15 schools usually don't need to write more than 5 core essays. So we really help students. We don't want students to have to write more than they have to. So we recycle essays, and we work to produce 5 core essays that can be iterated in different ways across the supplemental requirements. This approach definitely helps us budget time wisely with students, and set them up for all of their applications to be finished by September, by the start of their senior year. Alrighty, so I'm going to let Amber kind of walk you guys through our services. I'll just hand things back to her.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Angelica, for that wonderful description of college consulting, the process of college admissions overall for the 11th and 12th graders, as well as how we work with students and what all like juniors and seniors should really be thinking about whether or not you work with us. So to outline our services, also just one aside is I've seen some really great questions come in over chat, and we're going to be addressing those questions as soon as the presentation is over, which will be shortly. And just encourage everyone to ask their questions via chat only, so that we can, be done in good time and make sure, to get your questions answered appropriately. So in terms of our services, so prior to junior year, that's the 8th grade to 10th grade planning services. We offer long-term planning, which includes topics like test prep strategy, high school coursework, extracurriculars, summer planning, pre-college programs, internships, etc. And so even if you don't work with us, we recommend long-term college planning. So really just thinking through like, how am I exploring my interests? How am I kind of narrowing down what my interests are and making sure that by the time that I get to the college application process that I'm a qualified candidate to study what I think that I want to study in college, right? And I have like a clear narrative of a major or majors that I'm interested in studying. And so along with, of course, like augmenting your profile outside of your academics as well. So then during junior year, once we have data, including the test scores, the ACT or the SAT, our services are going to include compiling an ambitious yet balanced college list. And so what that looks like, for each student is going to be different. It's hard with, some of the questions because the answers to so many of them are, it depends, it depends upon your student, it depends upon your family, what your goals are. Do you want to, go to, one school versus another school that's in a completely different place on the college rankings and therefore in selectivity. So our recommended actions and next steps are going to be different, on a short-term and long-term basis. So in terms of the ambitious yet balanced college list, so be realistic, do look at Naviance, and it's literally there in the data for you, so that you can see it. What are your grades and test scores, right? What are the average grades and test scores for the schools that you think that you might be interested in? And just understand that, you want to make a balanced list, and what that looks like for each person is going to be different. So considering the most strategic application approach, including early action, early decision choices, and major choices. So we help students to evaluate where they're going to apply early and what majors might make sense at the different schools. And then planning thought out campus visits and additional follow-ups. Then constructing a focused but holistic resume. So ensuring that your relevant activities are highlighted and that you appear both as a well-rounded and balanced person, but also, focused, right, in your areas of particular interest. Next are, yes, writing, and more writing. So for, most students, like this is going to be the most important part of the college application process, right? Because your grades are already pretty much set and you should really focus on, making sure that those are as high as possible. But testing is important. Everybody should have a plan for testing, as we've already described. But in terms of the application process, really just, we work with students to organize all of their essays, to figure out where there's complementarity between the various prompts, and then, coming up with different ideas, selecting the most promising ideas, outlining those essays, and then editing and re-editing them. And then when they're like great and we're super happy with them and they can be finalized, our services would include converting and modifying them for the various prompts, as Angelica described, right? So even though it might look like you have, 18 prompts, 20 prompts, we should be writing hopefully only about, 4 to 6 core essays. Then managing all applications and their due dates and conducting final reviews. So creating an application plan specific to each student based upon their school list and their needs. And then lastly, conducting final reviews. So looking over the applications when the applications are finalized and ensuring everything looks perfect or as near to it as possible. Preparing for your interviews. So we also provide mock interviews with our students where we ask them questions and provide them with feedback, which helps them, just feel more confident. And then dealing with deferral and wait list. So how do we follow up? Who do we follow up with? What kind of things do we want to include in our follow-up to continue to demonstrate that interest, to let the school know we're very keen on them? And then provide post-admissions decision-making. So evaluating your various options and kind of thinking through the pros and cons. Okay. Yes. Okay. So we come to the conclusion of the presentation. And we're going to then turn it over to the questions that you've been asking. So our parting advice for everybody is maintain a good GPA and weighted GPA. Try to complete your SAT and ACT testing by the end of junior year so that you know where you're going to be able to apply and be qualified for, right? And that you can create that balanced list. Go ahead and build your resume, right? And no matter where you are, 8th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, make sure you're thinking about how you're spending your time and the kinds of messages that you're communicating with how you spend your time. If you play video games 99% of the time, that's probably fine if you want to be a video game designer, right? But if you're not wanting to do that, then maybe you should be doing something more career oriented with your time. And then making sure you appear as holistic, well-rounded, but focused. Get life experience, do something different, unique, get out of your comfort zone, and that will both make you a better person, and it'll also hopefully give you good fodder for your college essays as well. All right, so, and then we cannot emphasize this enough. Hopefully we've made it very clear. We start working with students in January of their junior year. It's really, really hard to put together a great application that you're starting in September. You should be done with all of your essays come September, not starting to write them because, obviously things that are rushed tend to be not of the same quality that they could otherwise. It can take time to really self-reflect and think about the most important people, experiences, challenges that you've faced, and to be able to express those in a compelling and emotional and funny way to admissions so that you will be remembered and you will stand out of the other, highly qualified students in the admissions process. So that concludes the presentation portion of our presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and start taking a look at these questions that you've asked. Thank you so much for those. And Angelica and I are going to be answering these questions. So let me see. I'm going to go ahead and look at some of these questions. Okay. So let's see. Question was, all right. For early decision, what if the student got admitted, but the offered financial aid or grant was not as we expected? Is the student still bound to attend? So Angelica, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure, I can answer that. I think that we recommend that students, only apply early decision if financial aid is not a real consideration. Although, there are some kind of rare instances where students might be able to get out of the binding agreement, that is a big hassle and kind of, you know, is up in the air. And so we don't recommend going through that process just because it can be really challenging. Amber, is there anything else that you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that schools really care a lot about, you know, about the integrity of this early decision. So they, you know, as we're applying early decision more than one place, you cannot do that, right? And you're basically saying I'm binding myself to you, so you can only do that to one school. But if you have like a huge change in status, in financial status, something unfortunate happens, then that can be a grounds upon which to, you know, not be bound. But if you don't have a change, then no. And so then no, like, you know, it's not going to be an easy process at all for you to get out of it. And I don't even know if you really even can. So, you know, part of what attracts schools as well as the yield piece is the student's ability to pay. So that's something that, especially during these, like, you know, these pandemic times, is especially attractive to schools. So also for ED, also for ED, if not accepted to ED, should the student automatically be considered for the early admissions or standard admissions? That's a good question. Or the student has to submit an application again. So it really depends upon the school. Some schools will either give you a yes or a no, right? Like Vanderbilt is an example, right? So they're going to give you a yes or no, like you're not being considered at all for any part of the admissions process if you're being told no in early decision. It depends, like, and a lot of schools will defer you, and they will be deferred to the regular decision pool. But it's very individualized and like different by school, and what it actually means is very different as well. Like some schools, it could be pretty meaningful to be deferred, you know, because they're only going to defer you if they think you have a good shot. But some schools like Harvard, who do like restricted early action, which is slightly different than early decision. We didn't really get into the ins and outs of that, but it's basically like early, you're only applying to one private school early, so you kind of, you know, get your pick of a selective school or a school, you know, it's typically selective schools. So you get, you know, you would pick one of them and you're saying I won't apply to any of the other ones early, but it doesn't have quite the same increase or in your chances because it's not a binding decision. But anyways, like Harvard, for example, they defer almost everybody, and it's not very meaningful. So, okay, so do they have to submit an application again? No, they do not have to submit an application again. They will be automatically, you know, transferred into the regular pool if they are being considered. And if it's a no, then you'll be told no, and you're not going to be considered in the regular pool. All right, next question is, can you please answer the question on the criteria slide, like GPA versus weighted GPA, which one's more important, and how many APs a student should take? So those questions are questions that we normally work with students on. There's no like one answer to those questions, how many APs a student should be taking, because, you know, what one student who has, you know, a particular kind of academic profile, what they should be doing, and goals, like what you need to be doing if you want to go to, you know, Towson University, is probably very different from what you want to be doing if you want to go to Rice University. Those are just kind of like two, you know, examples picked out of the air, but you know what I mean? So what is appropriate for each student and what makes sense, you know, really varies, because if you put one student in, you know, a situation where they're kind of out of their depth academically, that's not going to be beneficial for them. Even they may be taking an AP class or an honors class or an AP class, right? They're taking an AP class, that gives them an extra brownie point, but they're getting an F. It's a brownie point on an F. It's not very helpful. Okay, so yes. So next question is, can you do early action and early decision to the same school? Angelica?
So usually you cannot apply early action and early decision to one school at the same time. There are schools that offer both early decision and early action options, but I think more frequently schools either have an ED or EA policy. So you wouldn't be able to apply both ED and EA to the same school, because the binding agreement would kind of cancel out the early action application. I think is that what the question was asking?
Yeah, it was. And then it's a two-part question. For ED, do we only apply for one school, and how many schools can we apply for early action?
That's a great question. I know that the intricacies of these of the early process can be a little bit confusing. So for ED, you can only apply to one school because you are giving a binding commitment that you would attend. So if you applied ED 2 places, how could you give them a binding commitment if you had extended that to 2 schools? With early action, kind of with the exception of restricted early action, like Amber was saying about Harvard, and a few other schools that have REA, where they say you can only apply to this, one school early action. You can apply to as many schools early action as are on your list or are available to you. There's not a cap on the early action applications.
Okay, great. What is your view on taking AP tests without taking the corresponding AP course? That really depends upon the student. People do it all the time, but I couldn't advise on your particular student's situation, not knowing more about their situation, but people do it all the time. So it is something that does happen. Okay, so next question is there a limited number of schools you can apply to with early decision, or can you apply to all which offer it? So Angelica answered that perfectly. I don't have anything to add to that. Next question is there any downside to visiting colleges very early in high school? I'm trying to see whether it makes sense to do so at the same time as spring, summer break travel. Okay, so yeah, the purpose of these kinds of visits is different than the ones later on, so there's no downside to it. I think these early visits can provide insight to students about the kinds of schools that they like, big, small, public, private, hot, cold, and just the general, feel and like what kind of school they would like to be at. And so these tend to be more exploratory in nature, whereas later on, we tend to be, more focused with the visit. So definitely not a downside with visiting colleges early. And then next is, are you able to advise on unique takes and ways to work through a student's extracurricular profile? That is something that we do with students. So we, as part of our college planning process, will go over with students and parents, the student's profile, their goals, and make recommendations on, things like coursework, their extracurriculars inside and outside of school, their test prep timeline, and also on summer planning. And so as part of that, we can help students to think of ways to stand out. So that's one of the things that we do cover. If you'd like to find out more, please do feel free to, to get in touch with us for our consultations so that we can explain, more so the ins and outs of our college planning services. All right. All right. Can we please revisit criteria slide? Okay. Sure. Why not? Okay. So let's go like this. Criteria. College admissions criteria. Okay, so, right. Yes, so these are all the things that we work on with students. Let me see. Really, how we do it, it depends, is very individualized per the student, like which test they should take. Obviously, that depends upon the student. For example, Students can come in and take a free mock with us at any time. Right now we're doing them virtually, and we'll do a consultation with students and parents regarding which test we'd recommend and how they could do test prep. And we do, as part of the other services that we offer as an organization, offer both classes and one-on-one tutoring for testing. As for exactly what a student should be doing in these different areas, again, I have to go back to, it depends on whether you're shooting for, a top 60 school versus a top 10 school, right? Or whether you're pre-law or you're pre-med. So I can't make more specific or personalized recommendations on that without knowing your student and their profile. Okay, you can always go with education loans if we don't get good financial aid. So unfortunately, that's not part of the services that we provide with, the kind of financial aid process and FAFSA or CSS. We help students with, they're looking over their applications and with essays and with creating an application plan, but we don't work with students on financial aid. So I couldn't really speak too much to that. But yeah, so I wouldn't want to answer that one because it depends upon a person's situation. Okay, so next question is, the student will spend time on the activities they enjoy. Just wondering if there's a way to extend them in a unique way. If you could speak to that, it would be helpful. Well, I mean, I think that really depends upon the student. Like, so if you were on like the national news for the activity that you enjoyed because you enjoyed it so much, that probably would be, almost definitely something that would help you in the admissions process. As to how you get there, that's a process that's ongoing over time. And so we do help students to think about that and to like evaluate other, make recommendations to them on how they can start to like build that. But not knowing your student and their profile and their goals, which is part of what we work with students on college planning, I wouldn't be able to make a specific recommendation because for each person that might be different. Like it might be, you have an Instagram page with 200,000 followers. Like that would be, that'd be really cool too. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that. And it's certainly something that we would work with our planning students on. Okay, next, I mean in this scenario BD. Oh, the financial aid thing. Yeah, I don't know about the financial aid piece with ED and that. I do know that it's recommended, as we said a few times, that you should apply ED if financial aid is not a concern. Okay, how do the schools know if you have applied early decision to other schools? Angelica?
So you basically, when you apply ED, you sign like a binding agreement that if accepted, you will attend. I think, I don't know if implied in the question is, I guess technically maybe, or well, schools, I don't know, it's a little bit complicated, but they're not, you don't want to be in a position where you've applied, to more than one school ED. First of all, your high school guidance counselor would know because they would send your transcript and in addition, all of your materials to schools for an early decision application. So that would kind of be out of the question, and you just wouldn't want to be in that position where you would apply to more than one school ED. I guess in terms of, yeah, like it's,
yeah, they care more about ED as an institution, shall we say, than they care about one particular student. So your student would, in all likelihood, I'd be very surprised if it wouldn't happen. They would be blacklisted from, many schools, all of the schools probably. So that would be, it's always nice in theory, right, to increase your chances at a lot of different places, but it's not the right thing to do. And impossible because, yeah, I think nearly impossible because the counselor would know.
Okay. Yeah.
Are we currently taking 10th grade students right now? Yes, we are currently taking 10th grade students. Please feel free to, I will send out the presentation afterwards, and please feel free to get in touch with, myself to arrange a consultation. or Angelica as well. So we'd be more than happy to speak with you. Okay, do AP scores matter, Angelica?
I mean, I think, yes, I think the answer is yes. They do matter. I think it is important, you know, to see that a student has mastered a certain area, that they've taken challenging courses. But again, in terms of strategizing for APs, that's something that we do on an individual basis, and kind of counsel students, you know, regarding their individual curriculum.
Okay, what current trends are affecting admission? So we went over that regarding, you know, the impacts of like the 2021 cycle. Other trends, these are things that we, you know, make sure that students are aware of in terms of grading policies and things like that. You're probably mostly all aware of, you know, MCPS, kind of grade inflation due to grade, you know, grading policies changing and things like that. So we like to make sure that students are abreast of different trends like that. Okay, which one matters more, GPA or weighted GPA? So with that question, they both matter, but weighted GPA matters slightly more because it gives you information about how rigorous a student's you know, their coursework is. So for example, you can have like a 4.0 GPA and a 4.0 weighted GPA because you got straight A's, but you didn't take any weighted courses, right? And you can have at the other extreme, like a 4.8 weighted GPA and a 4.0 GPA, right? So a high weighted GPA and a high GPA, but you can't have the other way. You can't have a low GPA, right? You can't have like a 3.0 GPA and like a 4.6 weighted GPA. Like that's not possible. So it gives you a little bit more information about both like the students' grades and the rigor of the courses that they're taking. But what is right, it really varies by the student, right? So yeah, that's that for GPA and weighted GPA. How important are internships for your college application? Thank you so much for all these great questions, by the way.
Yeah, they're great.
Angelica, would you like to address that?
Yeah, I think that we definitely encourage our students, you know, to take any internship opportunity that they can, especially, you know, if it relates to their academic interests or maybe is a way for them to enhance some of the extracurricular pursuits or expand those pursuits that they've already kind of, you know, delved into. I think it only shows, you know, students engaging with a field that they're passionate about. You know, it shows initiative, curiosity, and can definitely be something that's beneficial. I think very rarely would having an internship, you know, hurt your application.
Okay, next question. Do we help students to find internships? So we certainly make, as part of the college planning process, make recommendations to students regarding internships that are relevant to their interests. As for you know, helping students with the applications, that's something that we can help with on an additional hourly basis in terms of just, you know, like helping them to brainstorm ideas for those essays and to review those essays. So in terms of like, yeah, hopefully that answers that question. Okay, what experiences highlights for an internship should I talk about in the college essays? Angelica?
I think, again, that's something that we would advise on an individual basis. I think a huge kind of component of deciding what to mention in those, you know, supplemental essays in particular is how does that experience relate to a student's overall profile and to their overall narrative and to their prospective, you know, academic interests as well. So that would be something that we would really strategize and dive into on an individual level.
Okay, so as we, it's 3:23, as we, you know, come up on 3:30, I want everyone to, you know, feel free to peel off if you need to, and we're gonna try and get all these questions answered, but if you need to go, then, you know, we will be continuing to record and we will send out the recording afterwards, after our session is done. Okay, could you elaborate more about tier ones? Not too much, really. I mean, tier one activities are activities for which a student is garnering recognition for on a national or international basis. We call tier 2s ones where students would be having it on like a regional basis, that recognition, and tier 3s on the school level. So tier 1s really help a student to stand out for the top schools, but as for what a tier 1 like should look like for each student, it's very different. So that's something that we advise on an individual basis. AOs stand for, the second question is, what do AOs stand for? Admissions officers. So you'll have a regional admissions officer for your school and for each school in your area. So just making sure that you reach out to them with some with some questions, right? That are going to help you rather than take away from your candidacy. Okay. When would you suggest to start college visits? My son is in 11th grade now. Angelica?
So if your student is in 11th grade, I mean, I think that spring break is an excellent time. I don't know, where your child is at high school or what that schedule is like, but I think the spring, early summer at the latest, I think as much information as you can have. We really like to recommend that our juniors, have a pretty solidified college list kind of by the spring of their junior year. So I think as early as you can. I know that with COVID, it's definitely complicated some of the logistics surrounding that, but even getting on campus and kind of trying to see the feel of a place could be really, really helpful in kind of honing and narrowing that college list.
Okay, is an AP score of a 4 considered good? That would depend upon a student's individual situation and goals. So it would depend. I couldn't answer like a blanket yes or a no to that question of whether or not it's something that they should, kind of submit for a particular school. Okay, let's see. But those are the kinds of conversations that we would have with students regarding their application. Do colleges consider the difficulty of specific classes a student takes, as some AP classes are more difficult than others? So yes, rigor and taking, we really encouraged our students this last year to take a very rigorous course load, because this is a way for you to stand out rather than kind of taking an easy senior year or whatever the case might be. Continue to take rigorous classes, do where applicable, send your mid-year reports, show that you're not, having that senioritis. I mean, it was a little different this year with the senioritis, but they do absolutely consider the difficulty of specific classes. And so, what the right combination looks like is different for different students. Again, I'll go back to kind of the pre-law, pre-med example, but certainly they will take into account. Okay. Next question, how do we write about internships in the college application? I think we already addressed that question, just saying that would depend upon the student. What do we specifically write about about the internship we conducted in order to impress colleges? So we certainly help students, what we would ask is for a student to come up with, a number of ideas to pitch to us as a consultant. And we can help them to parse through those ideas and pick the best one, the most compelling one, and then to kind of outline the essay and to tell the story and to show these traits about themselves that would make them a great candidate for the school. So that would really depend upon the students' stories about the internship. There's no hard and fast rule about what they would write about it or how they should write about it. Okay. Yes. Are we able to help students find the internship? I hope that was addressed regarding making recommendations to students for different internships that they can look at that are relevant to their interests, their academic interests. My pleasure. Lisa, thank you. Okay. Next question. Do colleges recalculate GPAs and weighted GPAs based upon what they want to see? For example, if applying to an engineering program, will they take out AP US History and AP Psychology? Angelica?
No, I don't think that you can expect that, you know, a college is going to, or that an admissions officer is going to necessarily take the time to recalculate your your overall GPA to kind of frame it how they would want. That being said, you know, they might, if you're applying to an engineering college, classes that are pertinent to engineering and your grades in those might be considered more closely in certain circumstances. But I think in terms of, you know, the notion of them recalculating a full GPA, that seems pretty implausible.
Okay, next question is, do we have experience with guiding on BSMD programs? So for those who don't know, BSMD programs are bachelor's programs that go direct through to medical school. So a student would know upon entering college that they would be, you know, accepted as well if they maintain certain criteria that's different for each school, that they'll be going to medical school. So these programs are extremely competitive, as you know, there's, you know, often only like, you know, a very small number of slots open for the programs, and there's not that many programs available across the country. And we do have experience with guiding on these programs. All right, let's see. Okay, so I think that's it for the questions. I don't see any more questions here. I hope that it was helpful. I will stay on, we will both stay on for another couple of minutes to, you know, just in case there are any additional questions. And I want to thank you so much for joining. And if you'd like to find out more information about our services, either for college planning or for college consulting, please do feel free to get in touch with us as we'll be sending out these materials. And I had a question about our pricing. What we do when we talk about our services is we'll explain our services in detail and answer any questions that you have, and our services will include that conversation that we'll have with you, which is a 30-minute free consultation, will include, you know, the information about our pricing. So yeah, please do schedule a consultation with one of us if you're interested in finding out more. Angelica, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, just thank you all for joining. Like Amber said, you know, we hope this was really helpful, and we look forward to hopefully getting to know a few of you guys and working together.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. We're going to stay on for another, you know, couple minutes or so in case you do have any more questions. And you're so very welcome, and thank you for joining us on this sunny Sunday.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. I have a question.
Can you ask it in the chat?